It's time
Welcome
to
to
grow.
the Illuminate
Meghan Jones
Recovery
joins us today
podcast.
from Deer Hollow Recovery
We shed
to
light
share her
on mental
story
health
about
issues,
being a rebel youth,
mental illness,
not having
and
a
addiction
tribe,
recovery,
and the challenges
ways
of
to
teen
cope,
addiction.
manage,
She has found her
and
own rhythm in
inspire.
recovery and
Beyond
talks about
self-care, we will
suicidal
discuss you
ideations with
may
us.
need the help
She's been
of a
helping
licensed
promote
professional.
change in individuals for the last decade.
My name's Kurt Nider. I'm a husband, a father, entrepreneur, a handyman, and a student of life. I avoid conflict, I deflect with humor, and I'm fascinated by the human experience.
And I'm Shelley Mangum. I am a clinical mental health counselor, and my favorite role of all times is grandma. I am a seeker of truth, and I feel like life should be approached with tremendous curiosity.
I ask the dumb questions.
I fill in the gaps.
The Illuminate Recovery Podcast is brought to you by Illuminate Billing Advocates. Make billing and collection simple with leader in substance abuse and mental health billing services. Verification and analysis of benefits, pre-authorizations, utilization management, accurate claim submission and management, denial and appeal management, and industry-leading reporting. Improve your practice's cash flow and your ability to help your clients with Illuminate Billing Advocates.
Today we are with Meghan Jones. She is the Director of Operations at Deer Hollow Recovery. She also works at PTSR Retreats. Meghan has been involved in dual diagnosis treatment for many, many years. She has spent a lot of her time with direct client care and has recently switched to administrative positions. She is incredibly satisfied in either side of treatment as long as she's learning new things, which I think is also a passion of mine. Meghan, thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me on. I'm excited.
So Meghan, I'm just curious, and it's always good to kind of start at the beginning. Give us kind of some background of how you ended up in recovery. And I always find this interesting because I don't necessarily think that there's a whole ton of people that start out as little kids and go, man, I'm going to go be in recovery. That's what I want to do for my career, right? And I know that was not true for me either. So I'm curious, what's your background and how did you end up in the recovery industry?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's true. I don't know a ton of people that are like, yeah, I want to go work in residential or, whatever. But I did definitely from a young age, there was an interest and an intrigue in becoming a therapist, which is not a route that I want to go down anymore or that I did take for various reasons. But I am in recovery myself. I got sober in April of 2011. And, I got sober in the 12-step community. I did not go to treatment. I did have previous experiences. I was court ordered to IOPs, and when I was 17, I was in like a adolescent lockdown psych ward, as happens, right? So I definitely had some exposure to these different environments, but ended up actually getting sober in 2011. And during my first year, so many friends of mine, I want to work in treatment. I want to give back in this way. And I never had that. I very much did not want to do that, actually. I didn't really have a ton of a direction as to what I wanted to do, but I certainly thought that I would end up on a little bit more of a creative path. I loved photography. I loved taking pictures and drawing and painting, and I definitely thought I was going to go into that starved artist, the pathway. And it just so ended up, I got a year sober, and a couple of months went by, and I was working at, then it's gone out of business, but it was like a photo studio, and I was selling cameras, and I was really into makeup and doing makeup, and, not making a lot of money. I was making $8 an hour and really, very paycheck to paycheck. And the opportunity came for me to speak at a treatment center called Recovery Ways in Murray and tell my story. And I think I was just a year sober at the time. And I was offered a position, or at least, maybe not outright offered a position, but I was definitely welcomed, like, hey, we have openings. Like, no, I don't really want to do that. This isn't really my path. But a couple of months, went by. And there was a woman in the rooms who worked there who I really connected with. And it just kind of clicked. And I was like, maybe I do. Maybe I do want to try this. So I interviewed and got hired in July of that year, 2012, and started working as a coordinator, which is basically a psych tech, like frontline staff, and have stuck around since. It's turned into something really cool and rad, and that I never wanted to do, but I don't know what else I would do now. I feel pretty entrenched at this point.
That's kind of interesting journey as you would step back and go, yeah, I really don't want to do this. This isn't really where I want to go. But I think that kind of lends to the community and the connection that's involved in recovery, right? It's part of what recovery is all about, and connecting with people. And so on some level it becomes family when you get that close to people. And so there is definitely an attractive piece to that.
Very much so. I would argue that the community aspect of any program, but my experience in the 12-step program was probably, obviously I worked the steps and did all of that as well, but that was probably the huge shift, feeling a part of.
So I'm curious, as you tell your story about recovery and what that looked like, yours isn't necessarily, well, maybe it's typical, but the stories we typically hear are people that have gone to residential, they couldn't get sober on their own, they tried a lot. But with the help of 12 steps, it sounds like you were pretty successful. Can you kind of talk about maybe some of the challenges that you feel like got you into the drug world, and then how you ended up, what were your key pieces? And sometimes there's those key moments in time that shift things for you. Maybe there was some of those. What are those key pieces that now bring you to sobriety?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, because it isn't really, it does have that abnormality that I did not go to treatment, and kind of rewinding to the community comment that we were just talking about, I think that looking back, is a huge part of why I started using, both because I felt so alone, and it wasn't really a peer pressure thing, but that was a really easy source of community at the time to start, using drugs. And, I started pretty young. I used for the first time when I was 12, and I huffed gasoline in my friend's parents' garage, and with one of my friends, and it was an absolute blast. I had just the best time ever, and it just sort of escalated from there, where I started smoking cigarettes and smoking weed and drinking. And obviously, as years progressed through those adolescent times, things definitely escalated, to the point where I was kind of just a garbage disposal, for lack of better terminology. You put it in front of me and I wanted to try it, and that certainly didn't lend itself to surrounding myself with great influences or great people. Not to say that they're bad, but they certainly didn't have a positive impact on my life at the time. Between that time at a really young age, and I guess maybe I should have started with, I grew up in a really small town, in Utah, where a lot of the community, certainly was, I'll just say it, they were LDS, and my family was not. And I have nothing against the LDS religion. I just want to preface that and not get any hate or get canceled or backlash. And my truth and my experience as a young child, age 5, is that I was ostracized from my community. It was a really small town, and I was told I wasn't allowed to go jump on the trampoline with my neighbor, for reasons that I didn't understand at the time, right? So I should have probably started there with the real crux and core of not feeling good enough, not feeling worthy, not feeling a part of. So fast forwarding back to kind of my adolescence, we moved as a family across the country a couple of times, from this really small town to the capital of Michigan, back to Camas, and then I moved back to Detroit with my mom. She was taking care of her elderly father, who ended up passing And that is when, that move is when things really, really escalated for me. You know, I'm a 16-year-old high schooler, just on the brink, you know, using substances and not listening to my mom, who's already going through this horrible time in her life, losing her father, and not getting along with my dad. And it was just not great. So I ended up, you know, getting in some trouble, and hence the psych ward comment earlier, and we ended up moving back, and my story certainly didn't stop there with drugs and alcohol. It just got worse and worse and worse, and the distance between me and my loved ones and my family and those I cared about just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And there was a point, I got sober really young. I got sober when I was 19, and there was a point from 17 to 19 where I was just not in regular communication with them, or any kind of meaningful communication with them. I was not living there. And it got to the point where I was, you know, getting legal charges. Like I said, I got court ordered to an IOP program that I got kicked out of for using and failing a drug test. And just this wedge from everything that I felt connected with and felt meaningful and purposeful in my life was kind of non-existent. And I was certainly still surrounded by people that loved and cared about me. I don't want to make it sound like my life was like I was totally alone. However, the feelings in my heart and soul, I felt absolutely alone and absolutely a burden to society and to those people that just wanted me to thrive. And it got to the point where I was basically, I had sort of a home base in this environment at a friend's house that was very unhealthy. And I was pretty much living in my car. And there was a point, and I guess maybe trigger warning, I have had from a pretty young age, probably from 13 or 14, I've had SI and suicide ideation for most of my adolescence. And there was a point at that time when I was like end of my 18th year on this planet, turning 19, where that became really serious. And I was starting to create plans and was truly just not in a good place. And there was a time I very, very vividly remember I called my mom, and she knew things were, even with our disconnection, mother, she knows me, or my mother knows me, I should say. She knew things were really starting to spiral pretty bad. And I called her after a while of not speaking, bawling my eyes out, just desperate could be, desperate as I had ever been. And my mom is not somebody that I really reached out to, so I think she knew things were pretty bad. And she was really, I have a family history of alcoholism on her side mostly. My father was a drinker who stopped for a really long, elongated amount, many years. But my mother specifically for this, her father was an alcoholic, her brother died of cirrhosis of the liver. It definitely was very rampant in her family system. And she had a child who was off the freaking rails at the time. She was, very luckily for me, extremely active in her Al-Anon program at the time. So when I called her, I begged to go to treatment and said, I don't think that I can do this on my own. I'm really, I didn't tell her how suicidal I was, but she could hear, like I said, that I was not well. And she said, we do not have the resources for that. You're going to have to figure it out. And it was a pretty abrupt phone call. And we hung up the phone, and I knew that I had burned that bridge and gone through those resources. And thank God she was strong enough to say that to me at the time, because the next day I reached out to someone who was basically a stranger, an acquaintance of one of my very longtime friends who I was drinking heavily with at the time, who had 9 months sober and was going to meetings. And I reached out to him, and he took me to candlelight at the Alano Club, and I have been sober since. It really is I mean, I don't say this from ego, but looking back, like, it is miraculous to me that all of that aligned, that my mom was so entrenched in her program, that this gentleman had just come in, like, young kid, you know, because I'm 19. I need some, like, crazy young people to go to meetings with, that he had just come into my life truly, like, within the 2 weeks prior, and he was willing to take me to a meeting. So I don't know if that even answered your question or if I just went on a 5-minute tangent.
Oh no, that was amazing. That was amazing. I love the way you kind of covered that and went into the details. You know, there are so many pieces of your story. I want to touch on a couple, and then go into, you know, the recovery piece and how you maintained that. But you know, yours isn't the first story where I've heard somebody say, I was in this LDS community and I just didn't belong. They wouldn't let me play with their kids, and they wouldn't let me. And of course, as a child, you don't understand that. And we don't necessarily say that was the catalyst for it all, but certainly, you know, those pieces all link together. Those wounds all kind of link together and create this picture of, I'm not worthy, right? I'm not lovable. And so I don't know. I like to talk about that. I would like to hope that that's changing. That's not, you know, that we don't see that happening as much. But I know it's still out there. I know people, good meaning people, who do that and don't recognize the harm that's happening, you know, to these little kids who shouldn't have to make those kinds of decisions and be, you know, pushed away like that. So I love that you bring that up. I think it's an important piece that should be talked about.
Yeah, no, I agree. That was a really, and I didn't realize, again, not knowing as a child, I didn't realize what an effect that would have on me later. And it certainly is not the only thing that made me feel unlovable or unworthy. And hindsight's 2020, that's big. You know, as a little kid, I've got these people I'm going to kindergarten with and I'm growing up with, and a lot of them, you know, by high school ended up being the most loving individuals in my life. However, the adults making those choices for them and you know, ultimately for me, certainly lent itself to a really big negative belief system.
Yeah. I'm curious about the suicidality and the depression that you experienced. When did that start playing a role? Was that always there? Was it? What's your thoughts on that? I'm curious how much of it was, you know, self-medicating induced, and how much of it is really part of, you know, just what you deal with.
Gosh, that's a really good question. I do believe it's something that I struggled with probably prior to picking up substances. You know, I sort of mentioned that my family moved across country a couple of times, and the first time that we did that was I guess I don't even know how old I was. It was after I graduated 4th grade, so I went to 5th and 6th grade from this little tiny town into this big city. And I remember that being a very painful experience. Obviously, I'm like leaving all of my best friends that I've grown up with since just such a young age. However, with that being said, I ended up having a great experience in Michigan during that time. I was very active in soccer. I had a big friend group around me. And with all that to be said, I remember very distinctly during recess a few times, and there are actually photos, because this was back in the like disposable camera days when I mentioned that I loved taking pictures, and that was something from a very young age that I loved to do even back then with the $5 disposable cameras, Kodak disposable cameras. There are pictures of me on the bench with all of my friends, and my head is just down, and I just am defeated, and I have all of these people around me, and that's where I just felt so alone. And that is really where that depression and stuff started to take hold, I think. Obviously I didn't have the wherewithal to understand what was going on with me at the time, but I think that was kind of where I can really pinpoint distinctly feeling very, very disconnected. And then moving back to the small little town, it's been a couple of years, all my friends have new friends, you know what I mean? So it just really piled on itself. And then I start using substances and kind of rolling with the small town crowd that are kind of like the rebellious people who, again, now I still, like, I'm loosely friends with them, and they're thriving, they're doing great, but we're adolescents in a small town. We're going to go, flip the bird and, and do all of that stuff. So I do think that it's something that I've struggled with for most of my life. I do think that it lent itself to my initial drug use, and then obviously drug use did not help that by any means, which is what makes that community aspect, like I said earlier, of when I did eventually get into recovery, so special to me, because I had felt so incredibly isolated for so long. Yeah.
That's I love your explanation. I love where you went with that. I think it lends to the fact that you've had a really strong recovery and you've done a lot of your own work that allows you to kind of see those pieces without them taking you out. So kudos to that. That's a huge thing.
Thank you.
I'm wondering about your recovery now, because with the dual diagnosis piece, you've got this suicidality going on and the depression that you've got to manage on top of your drug use. Talk about your recovery and how you manage to, what you do to manage those pieces of your life.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's actually, so, full disclosure, I'm not very active at all in the 12-step community anymore. And there was a time for my first 5 years of recovery that I was extremely active, from basically that first meeting on until, sometime in the last half a decade or so. And like I had mentioned, before going to the meeting and getting sober, I was getting really serious. I was kind of creating a plan. I was trying to figure out how I would, kill myself and lessen the burden of myself on society and on the people that I cared about, without and with the knowledge that doing that would create a burden, which is really a very, like, between a rock and a hard place to be. I've always had kind of some level of emotional intelligence in that way, to know how hard it is when someone does that, while also holding the true like gut-wrenching belief that me staying here is also just as harmful and just as painful. So I got very serious about not wanting to live anymore. And I'm not one that wants to blow smoke and lie and say that getting sober and going to meetings changed that. For the first little while, for my first probably 60 days of sobriety, I was still pretty severely suicidal. Less so, very much less so. I didn't have the alcohol and the drugs to, take me down those rabbit holes every day and night. But that was still there. It wasn't just me getting sober and getting to know these people and, having that community and having that place to go every day and night that took that away. And with that being said, I wasn't one that just jumped in and got a sponsor the first week either. I actually was pretty against that, mostly because I had these barriers of not wanting to open up and not being good enough, because what happens if I open up and I'm still not good enough and I'm already so fragile, I don't think I can handle that. And I ended up meeting someone. I met this girl in the rooms, and we went to coffee break one night, and she looked me dead in the eyes as I was telling her this and said, "What the do you have to lose, Megan, by asking for help? What do you have to lose?" And I was like, "You just said that? You just spoke to me that way?" And it landed. And I'm really grateful it landed, because, it was just a few weeks later, I asked a woman that had 20 years of recovery and I had almost nothing in common with, to sponsor me. And we went through the steps very rapidly, in like 6 weeks. And by my, I think I was 3.5 or 4 months, I was done with my steps and was raising my hand to be a sponsor. And it was this really, everything in my very early stages of recovery, both that call to my mom to sponsor, that happened in 4 or 5 months. It was very, very rapid, and I needed that, because I needed at that point to not think. And once I got through that period is when that suicidality really started to shift, and I started to be like, oh, I actually do feel a part of this. Like I went through these steps that everybody is talking about, and thank God for that. That woman that sat down with me, both my sponsor and that just told me straight, randomly at coffee one night, because it showed me someone actually cared enough to tell me the truth and call me out. And it changed my life. I mean, it truly changed my whole trajectory. So, yeah, that's kind of like the very beginning stages of my recovery, I suppose. Do you want me to keep going into the professional part, or you direct?
Well, but before you get into the professional part, I'm curious about the not being active, because that's like kind of a stigma a little bit, right? Like once you're an addict, you're always an addict. You got to just keep working the program. And I think you can have, a personal program where you're doing things to protect yourself outside of actually showing up to the meeting or whatever. But any addict can stop anytime they want, right? So there's kind of that balancing act of like what you're telling yourself. And so I'm curious about that, how has that changed for you? How do you wrap your head around, not really being part of that active program, and what does your day-to-day personal program, look like, right?
Yeah. Can I tell you how much that excites me? It's something that is hugely stigmatized, that I have felt personal judgment for and had my own kind of like unworthiness stuff come up again for. And I don't want to paint this picture that it was like one day I decided, because that's not really how it happened. I was very, very active. I mean, for that first year and 18 months of recovery, I mentioned, that specific meeting that I went to. I was chairing that meeting multiple nights a week, like co-chairing. I was extremely involved in recovery and attending meetings with a home group, with a sponsor, taking quite a few girls through the book, and doing kind of what I was told. I was doing the classic recovery, and that was an amazing experience for me and taught me so much and grounded me in spirituality. And that is where sometime around between like the 4 to 6 year mark, that's where I really focused, was that spirituality. Because what I was taught is, well, I guess there's kind of two things that I want to talk about with that. Is I was very grounded in this spirituality. I had this very structured program, this 12-step program that I was told worked and that did work for me, and that I was very passionate about, and that taught me that I have a daily reprieve contingent upon the maintenance of my spiritual program. And that one line to me is what keeps me to this day, because I have a daily spiritual program, and that very much is not structured in the same way that it was. It's not me like sitting down and reading the book every day, or reading any like specific book every day. What it looks like now is very much heeding that call of inspiration, which to me, you break inspiration down, that means in spirit. I heed that call every day. And sometimes that means a morning meditation. Sometimes that means, having an absolute, epic, and like looking at my shadow and my, like that damaged stuff that comes up, and working through it and writing through it. What it means to me now, or I guess what it does not mean to me now, is showing up to a meeting to save face so my recovery is good enough for you or them. That does not resonate with me right now. And it was sometime, probably around like the 5 to 6 year period, where I had that transition where I was like, I'm not doing this for me anymore. And I'm not even doing this for you. I'm showing up and acting like I'm this like beautiful pinnacle of recovery, to look good, and that does not fall within my value system. So I'm not active in a classic way, but I'm active in the way that like works for me.
But it speaks to me in like an evolution of values type way, right? Like when you started, you probably just had no values. It was all shame, all feeling bad about, this isn't good enough. I don't have these connections. I'm alone, all those kinds of things. And by the time you get to that point, I've come through this system of values, right? I've been able to make amends with other people. I'm making amends with myself. I'm becoming my person, right? And I'm helping other people. And I think the value, I'm not in 12-step either, right? So I'm sure this is cringeworthy on some level, but to be able to get to the point where you're saying, okay, I understand myself. I understand my emotional balance, right? Well enough to say that doesn't resonate with my values, right? Is like a sign of this new level of maturity, right? Which is pretty awesome.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I kind of skipped through part of when I was very active in recovery. I had a lot of people die in a very short amount of time, as we all do, right? Being a part of this community, that is an unfortunate reality. An immense amount of grief is, as we stay active and meet people, they drop off and they don't win the battle, I guess, for lack of a better word. And there was a time in that first 5 years where very rapidly people who were pillars in my life lost the battle. And so that emotional maturity and that kind of like growth certainly didn't happen just like one day standing on a rainbow ledge when kittens falling from the sky, It was definitely a lot of dark, icky stuff that I had to work through. I actually went through I don't want to call it a program, but like a workbook called the Grief Recovery Workbook with a group of women that were also in the program, and that was extremely enlightening and healing, and that showed me that not only do the 12 steps work for me, but so do other things. And I think that kind of started that, like, okay, so if that worked, all of these other things could probably work too, type of thing.
Well, and I love what you're talking about too, Megan, is because isn't recovery about staying sober and being healthy and living a healthy life? And isn't it unique to each person? And if you're maintaining sobriety and living a full life and finding satisfaction and happiness, then you've reached your goal.
Yeah.
And so I love the way the community sometimes says, well, if you're not going to AA, then you're really not serious about your recovery. Or if you're not doing this, then, or if you're on medication, you're really not serious about your recovery. And so there's those stigmas that I think we're still fighting. I think they're getting better, but I love the way you connect with yourself spiritually and can say, this is what works for me. This is where I feel like I need to go, and honor that despite the messages that are around you. Very powerful.
Well, thank you. And it certainly, I mean, my experience, as I've shared, I've always felt a little bit like a lone wolf, and I'm not going to lie and say that, through that transition period, people haven't distanced themselves from me, or maybe me distanced from them because of the kind of feelings of judgment that have come up. However, I'm still very close with people that are very active in AA, and those individuals I think are sometimes the exception, where they're open to being and like walking hand in hand with someone that's not right there like in the meeting with them, or walking down the exact same trail. I'm kind of like on this other trail going this way, but we're in the same forest type of thing, to be cheesy.
It's hard too, because I think it's hard for somebody who's going through that. They're already in an emotional, potentially volatile situation, right? And it's hard, I think, if you're in that situation, to look at you distancing yourself and being able to separate like their situation from your situation, but this situation, that as humans we're kind of constantly analyzing everything. And so as Megan's moving away, is she quitting and I should be worried, right? Or is she doing that well and I should be happy for her? And if she's doing that well, then what's wrong with me? And recovery looks different for everybody, right? And so what works for Megan might not work for me, and that's hard, right? Like that's a challenge for those individuals.
sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you, but I totally resonate with that, because I was very much that person. It is a self-preservation. When I'm entrenched, I get scared when I see someone that I love and that I care about distancing themselves, because does that mean that they're about to be the next person that falls off? What does that mean? So I empathize 100% with being in that position, and find it so incredibly beautiful for the people that have accepted, Meghan going and doing her own thing. And I still have people that'll call me out on my BS, because I'm far from not having a whole slew of BS, and I can say that while I laugh and smile. It's not this like heavy weighted blanket of shame that I have to carry around. It is what it is.
Yeah, it's interesting how kind of the extension to that is that as humans, we're just so tribal, right? Like we just resonate with other people who have similar experiences or whatever, which is kind of interesting in that, like, it goes back to the beginning of your story, right? Because sort of being, outcast from this LDS crowd, which I'm sure all of them would be mortified to find out about this now, right?
Oh, yeah.
But this is not like an LDS thing, right? Or a Christian thing. We just, as humans, we kind of tend to naturally do this, and it happens on race lines. It happens on, neighborhood lines. It happens on political lines and all that stuff, especially right now in the U.S., right? We see this, like, this tribal mentality is just crazy. So one of the tribes, obviously, that you have now is Deer Hollow. So what resonated for you about Deer Hollow? How did you end up there? And how does that tribe fit for you now with where you are in recovery?
I mean, you can see the grin on my face. I love that you just said that. I truly do feel like, and I guess maybe I hadn't realized it quite as much until I heard you say that, how much of a tribe I feel at Deer Hollow. So backtracking, because I've only been at Deer Hollow for about 3.5 years of my 9 years of experience. I worked at another treatment center for, the bulk of my time professionally. What an amazing experience that was. I feel, because of that center, so set up for success at Deer Hollow. And that's not to say that things went smoothly all of the time or were perfect. That center was it was also dual diagnosis, however, very much lent itself more to the substance use revolving door, lots of relapse prevention, lots of process groups. And they grew from, when I started, we were one residential facility and an IOP, and we grew to 2 residential facilities and an IOP, and then 2 residential facilities and a sober living, and then 4 residential facilities, and then, 3 residentials and like a huge IOP, and just grew. And I loved walking through that, even though like I said, it wasn't all great. I certainly had struggles personally and professionally in walking this journey. But because I didn't go to treatment, it introduced me to this whole new world of intensive, or what I thought at that time was really intensive therapy and community. And, I'd watch these groups of young people come in and struggle so hard, and, have house meetings where they, call each other out and go through these process groups where they would come out with tears in their eyes. And with what I know now, still wasn't the most effective, in my opinion, way to really address those core wounds. It absolutely worked for legions of people, and it absolutely did not work for legions of people. And the amount of people that I saw do things perfectly and come through and do the 90-day stay with the residential and the PHP and the IOP and follow their aftercare plan, but not actually still address those core wounds that I just mentioned, was astronomical and really, really heartbreaking. And again, that's not to say that the treatment center is bad or that anything is bad. It's just different strokes for different folks, I suppose. And knowing what I know now, moving into Deer Hollow, so I had a couple of different roles at that other center. I was a medical coordinator for a few years, where I was kind of in charge of working between the doctors and the clients and the pharmacies and handing out medications, including like Suboxone, Subutex, and things that are very stigmatized in the rooms. And then I got offered a position to become a case manager and took that. And how ironic, because I'm giving people resources for things that I didn't have resources for, and just learning so much that way. And I got a cold call one day in like December of 2017 or something from the executive director at Deer Hollow, because one of the therapists that I used to work with at that other center had moved along and mentioned my name and got a cold call and said, sure, it's time to grow. Let's do this thing. And walking into Deer Hollow, they used to put, they don't anymore, but there's a TV above the mantle right as you walk into the facility, and there was the daily schedule. And I'm like, 5.5, 6 years into my mental health dual diagnosis career, thinking that I know some stuff. And I looked at the modalities on that screen and was like, I don't know what any of these groups are. I don't know what it's like. You're speaking a different language. I have no idea what I just got into, and what a cool moment that was for me, for humility, to be like, oh, I've got a lot to learn. And that's what it's been. I mean, it's been so fulfilling and eye-opening. And Deer Hollow started as one of those run-of-the-mill substance use treatment centers, and is now, we're dual diagnosis with different levels of care, but our entire curriculum is based on treatment of trauma and PTSD. And it is a very intense program, and it is truly, it like spiritually resonates with me in a way that I didn't think was possible for a treatment center that is for profit and all of that. So
I'm curious. I know Deer Hollow has really evolved over the years, and I love the way that they've kind of focused more on what really seems to be some of those core issues, right? The trauma, the PTSD, and we're learning so much more about how to address that successfully. And so I love that, that the program is evolving. I'm wondering, I'm going to backtrack just for a second, because I'm curious. I'm curious about, because I imagine there's people out there that are going, oh, Megan's not really, she's not really an addict because she was just able to quit. And she's not really depressed because she didn't say anything about taking medication or ongoing problems. And it's all about, her drug use and things like that. And so I just wanted to come kind of maybe backtrack just for a second and talk about did you have relapses along the way? And did you ever go on medication for your depression?
I think you actually might have asked me that earlier and I just didn't answer it. So sorry about that. So I have not relapsed throughout my journey, and I did take medication. I was actually taking medication when I was still in my use, but it was very irregular. Obviously, as the lifestyle lends itself to. For the first about, maybe 6 months of my recovery, I was taking Wellbutrin and Trazodone to sleep, and I ended up, with a doctor's help, getting off of the Wellbutrin. It just wasn't something that I felt like I needed. Again, it was around that 4 to 5 month mark where I got through my steps and had this weight lifted. And that's not to say by any means that the 12 steps are a cure for depression. I'm just sharing my experience. But I kept on the Trazodone for a few months after that. And once my sleep cycle regulated, I didn't feel that it was needed anymore. And again, hindsight's 2020, going through some of those really hard times in my earlier years of recovery, I probably should have reached out to a psychiatrist or a practitioner to get back on medications, because I wasn't necessarily struggling with the suicidality, but I definitely was struggling with pretty bad social anxiety and depression. And I can't honestly tell you what the key was to moving through that, especially considering I still do struggle with anxiety in different ways. But I did also take a really strong focus on my health. I started going outside. I started like hiking like nobody's business. I started eating really well and focusing on some of those other factors or pillars. I'm not a clinician, so I don't know what the smart terminology is, but there's like your psychosocial factors and your health factors and all of that, and I started focusing on some of those other pillars that helped me stabilize as well, outside of just the spirituality and the substances. So.
I love that, and I love the way you share that, because and then the piece I want to bring up is that there may be someone out there that absolutely has to be on medication, that their depression or their anxiety is such that they can't manage it with tools and with mindfulness and with the spirituality that you're using, and it's not going to resolve for them like it did for you. And I know Kurt talked about this too, the comparison that we often do is, well, if Meghan can do it, I should be able to do it that way, right? And that's not healthy. That's just not healthy. We have to be in tune with what's going on in our own bodies and in our own situation, and be wise and ask for help, right? Because that's the quickest way to relapse or to end up having a depressive episode, is to not seek the treatment we need because we don't think that we should, or because of the stigmas around it. So I just want to, put that out there, that I think your journey has been yours and you've owned it fully, and that other people need to do the same. And I've had plenty of people say, I am so grateful for my depression medication and that I can get up and take that every day and my day is better because I do. And that might be someone else's journey. And I just want to put that out there so that people don't feel like there's a heaviness if they don't have the same journey as you do.
100%, Shelley. I think that is a vital point to make. And going back to my experience working in that treatment center as a medical coordinator, I would watch those medications that I was handing out over a 30 or 40-day stay, or even a 60-day stay, if they did multiple levels of care, truly uplift people and give them a new sense of quality of life. And it is a team effort between sometimes medication and some kind of supportive group program and diet and exercise and all of these other things. And it's to me, that's such an important message, and it's about the whole and having this like all-encompassing team of things to get you there. That's what I think I needed and we need. And I think the mistake that I probably did make in those years of suffering in sobriety was not reaching out for help and not asking for help. So it's a good point.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you, Meghan. Thanks for sharing that. Super powerful, and I'm loving your story. I'm loving your journey, and I would say that getting outside and really being diligent about moving our bodies. There's plenty of research that says that can be, for some, can be as beneficial as any antidepressant medication. And so you did really do some of that for yourself. You just did it in a little bit different avenue, and it worked for you.
Yeah, absolutely did. And going back even to professionally at Deer Hollow, I mean, I had those humbling moments of not knowing what the heck this program was about, but needing to because I got hired to speak with the families and do aftercare planning. So I had to talk to the families on the front end after the client was in treatment, and then set people up with an aftercare plan that was aligned with this new program that I was unfamiliar with. And so I really had to, I sat individuals in the company down and said, like, tell me what this is about. Tell me what you do. I need to understand. Please teach me. And through that, not only was that professionally very eye-opening about what you were talking about, how for many of us, maybe not all of us, because we all do have individualized paths, many of us, our substance use does go hand in hand with some sort of trauma, and that trauma does not have to be a big, huge event. A lot of my trauma, I do have a couple of those big, huge events, but a lot of my trauma are those little things, like the being ostracized from my community, like, you know, that person giving me a weird side look or telling me that photography wasn't for me, or, you know, whatever it is, like those little things that we don't give enough oomph to, I guess, that really, really, like, I took those, I picked those little pieces up and I held them, and they didn't help. So getting to know Deer Hollow, getting to know how those things do intertwine was vital for me personally and professionally, and has become such a passion and like a fire in a new way, because man, is that program intense. And man, do I see people come in a short amount of time and truly have a new outlook upon life like I've never witnessed before in almost anything else. It's really, really beautiful.
That's awesome.
That's a pretty incredible story, Meghan. I can't thank you enough for being willing to come on and share your perspective. We could probably talk for hours and hours, because I can tell that you are so engrossed in learning everything that you can that helps people change, right? Helps people thrive. And that's pretty amazing. I love the work that you do, and I hope we stay in touch and keep having these kind of conversations, because they're super powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys for having me on, and thank you for starting the podcast and getting this open-minded view of, you know, individualized recovery and community out there, because it really is, it is so important, and you guys are doing a really great job.
Thanks, Meghan.
So.
Thanks, Meghan. Fantastic.
Thanks for the compliment.
Yes, you're welcome.